Do, 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 do. Hey, welcome in. Here we go. Welcome to Once Upon a Turkey Leg. Let me do something first before I start to read the stories. There we go. That looks great. Should have done that before. But happy Thursday, everyone. Welcome to Once Upon a Turkey Leg. And yeah, tonight I've got some fun Christmas stories to read to you. And I will get going on that in about a minute or so. I want to share some. Hey, Stitch and Angel, welcome in. Wanted to show. I was at the store. Was it last week? During the past week, and I went to. Yeah, I went. Sorry, I went to the store, and I wasn't planning on buying a Hallmark ornament, but I saw some there, and I took a look to see what they had, and this is the one I got. Got the Mandalorian. Should probably take this out of the case. You can see that a little bit better. Well, glad you're here, Stitch and Angel. Always great to have friends in the streams. Ooh, okay. So I'm going to take that out the box. Here is the ornament. The Mandalorian ornament. I saw it. Decided to get it. This is the way. So there we go. Hey Tina, welcome in. And Chuck, you are having a gobbletastic evening. So yeah, there's that. There is that. So that's my newest Hallmark ornament. That's my addition this year. And I'll have to show all my Hallmark ornaments on my Let's Talk Turkey in a couple of weeks. But without further ado, because there is some reading I gotta do, I've got not one, but two Christmas holiday favorites. And the first story is It's a Wonderful Life, the illustrated holiday classic. Adapted by Paul Rodidis, illustrated by Sarah Conradson. So before I read, if you have not already, bop the like button. Anyone watching the replay, let me know in the comments that you were watching. Appreciate it. Let's go on with It's a Wonderful Life. A long time ago, back before there were televisions, before computers existed or credit cards, long before all of that, a boy named George Bailey was growing up in a little town called Bedford Falls. He lived in that little town, never knowing that an angel named Clarence was watching over him. Clarence was really an angel, second class. That meant he hadn't earned his wings yet. Clarence watched as George played with his friends. He saw the time George saved his younger brother Harry when he fell through the ice. He watched as George worked at Gower's drugstore, running deliveries and helping the customers. One day, George stopped Mr. Gower from accidentally giving the wrong medicine to a sick child. Mary Hatch often visited the store just to spend time with George. Clarence watched it all. When George got older, he worked for his father at the Bailey Brothers Building and Loan Office. George's father and his uncle Billy helped people save their money so they could buy important things, like new homes. George didn't want to buy a new home in the little town of Bedford Falls. He dreamed of exploring the world and visiting exciting places he'd only read about in magazines. Years later, on the night before George planned to leave Bedford Falls to travel the world, he went to a party at his old high school. There he danced with Mary Hatch. The dance was in the school gym, which had been built over the old pool. A jealous boy tried to ruin George and Mary's dance by opening the floor. But that didn't stop them from dancing. George walked Mary home that night, wearing dry clothes he'd found for them in the locker room. They made wishes by throwing rocks at the old abandoned Granville house, trying to break the windows. George told Mary about his dreams to see the world. Mary didn't tell George what she wished for, but he made his best guess. On that same night, George's father passed away. No one trusted George's forgetful Uncle Billy to run the family business. George had to stay in Bedford Falls, or else the company would close and people would lose their money and their homes. That was exactly what Mr. Potter wanted. He was the wealthiest man in town, and he dreamed of owning all of Bedford Falls. A building and loan was one of the few businesses that could stop him from taking over the entire town. George stayed home to run the business. He gave the money he'd saved for his trip to his brother so that Harry could go to college and then run the business when he graduated. But when Harry came home after college, he had a wife and a good job that took him away from the little town of Bedford Falls. George realized that no one was going to take over the business. He was never going to leave Bedford Falls to explore the great big world. And Clarence saw that too. George didn't entirely mind staying in Bedford Falls because he and Mary had fallen in love. They got engaged and planned their honeymoon. It wasn't the great big trip that George had always dreamed of, but as long as he was with Mary, it would be wonderful all the same. On the same day as George and Mary's wedding, Mr. Potter bought the town bank and tried to take over the building and loan. George and Mary gave up all their savings to help George's customers. Now they couldn't afford to leave Bedford Falls for their honeymoon, but the business would not go out of business either. Mr. Potter would not win. Hi, Dawn, welcome in. That night, Mary told George to come to the abandoned building they'd made on their wishes on. She had bought it for them with the last of their money. They would have their honeymoon in that old house in Bedford Falls. Over the next few years, George and Mary turned that broken old house into a home. They filled it with four wonderful children named Pete, Janie, Zuzu, and Tommy. And they helped more people in Bedford Falls. For instance, George made sure that Mr. Martini got enough money to buy his own new home so he didn't have to keep renting the expensive house that Mr. Potter owned. George helped even more people move into new homes, and the little town of Bedford Falls began to grow. When a war broke out overseas, George stayed in Bedford Falls, protecting people from Mr. Potter's greed and working with with Uncle Billy to make sure their business stayed open. George's brother, Harry, went off to fight in the war where he saved hundreds of soldiers. Everyone in town was proud of Harry. The president even gave him a special award. Uncle Billy was so excited he forgot to put the customer's money in the safe. He accidentally left it all behind when he was bragging to Mr. Potter about Harry on Christmas Eve. Hi, Tim. Welcome in. Happy Thursday. It was the most important thing Uncle Billy had ever forgotten. Now it was now it was George's responsibility to find the money because he was the boss. If he didn't find it, he could go to jail. George and Uncle Billy searched all over town, but they didn't find anything. When George got home, he found his youngest daughter, Zuzu, upset because her flower had lost some petals. He couldn't fix that either, so he hid the petals in his pocket. It was the worst Christmas ever. George was so upset that he yelled at his family, even though they'd done nothing wrong. Mary told George to leave. Then she started calling people for help. She could tell that her husband was very sad. Oh, sorry. Let me turn off. I've got notifications popping up on my computer. All right. Okay. Tim, you are right on time. Although I had already started the story, but there's always the replay. I am reading It's a Wonderful Life. George went to the only person who could help. Mr. Potter was the richest man in town. Surely he could lend George the money, but the evil banker refused George's pleas for help, never admitting that he had the missing money all along. Uh-oh. George couldn't go home, and he couldn't go to anyone else for help. No one in the little town of Bedford Falls had the amount of money he needed. What's this doing? Okay. Let's try to turn the page. Okay, here we go. George felt like a complete failure. He blamed himself for not being able to save the business, and he thought that Bedford Falls would be a better place if he weren't around to make things worse. That's when he heard the shouts from a man who'd fallen into the river below. George did what he always did. He dove in to help. George saved the man and learned that it was Clarence, the angel second class, who had been watching over him. Clarence tried to convince George that he wasn't a failure and that his life actually had been pretty good. George didn't believe any of it, especially not the part about Clarence being an angel second class. To prove it, Clarence made George's wish come true. Back at Mr. Martini's bar, Clarence tried to explain that helping George was the only way he'd earn his wings to become a full angel. George wasn't paying attention. The place looked so different. Let me make sure I didn't skip a page. Okay, there we go. George wasn't paying attention. The place looked so different, and his friend, Mr. Martini, was gone. Even the bartender, Nick, was different. But nothing prepared George to learn what happened to his old boss from the drugstore. Mr. Gower had spent years in prison because George hadn't been around to stop him from giving the wrong medicine to that sick child. So many things were different. Was it possible that Clarence was telling the truth? Maybe George had never been born, but George still wasn't ready to believe it. Not even when he discovered his daughter's flower petals were gone. George hurried home, surprised to find that the quiet little town of Bedford Falls had somehow become a big, noisy town called Pottersville. The building and loan had gone out of business years ago because George wasn't around to run it. With no one to stop him, Mr. Potter had taken over the entire town and made it a terrible place to live. And the changes didn't end there. George and Mary's home was still abandoned, as if his family had never lived there. His own mother didn't recognize him. Because George had never been born, no one had been around to save his little brother when he fell through the ice. Clarence explained that without Harry Bailey in the war, no one saved all of those soldiers either. George was horrified to discover that the love of his life, Mary Hatch, didn't recognize him. If she didn't know him, then their children had never been born either. That's why Zuzu's petals weren't in his pocket. George was heartbroken to see that all these bad things had happened just because he'd never been born. George went back to the bridge where it all started, hoping that he could make everything right. He was alone again, but he called out to Clarence. Hey Mandy, welcome in. Happy Thursday. A moment after he asked for help, George's friend found him again and recognized him once again. George was thrilled, but not nearly as happy as when he realized his daughter's flower petals were back in his pocket. Everything was back to normal in Bedford Falls. Everyone on the street recognized George again. The Bailey Brothers Building and Loan was still in business. Only grumpy old Mr. Potter was upset by George's happiness. George ran all the way home. He knew the police were waiting there for him, but he didn't care. His family would be there too, and that's all that mattered. He never expected what else would be waiting at home for him. Ooh. But first, there's Bedford Falls. But what else is waiting at home for him? Everyone in Bedford Falls that George had ever helped turned out to support him in his time of need. They could replace all the missing money by adding together what little cash they each had. The business would survive. George may never have left the little town of Bedford Falls, but he'd spent every day of his life helping those people in turn, helping the people around him. And those people in turn were there for George when he needed them. Mr. Potter might have all the money in the bank, but money wasn't nearly as important as all the people who had come to help George in his time of need. On top of the money his friends had collected, George found a gift from Clarence. It seemed that George wasn't the only one whose dream had come true. And that is the end of It's a Wonderful Life. That is right. I love that quote, Dawn. I actually posted that on Instagram yesterday or day before. I remember right recently, the last couple of days. Love that quote. Love that quote. All right. Well, without further ado, because the night is quickly passing. Anyway, here's another favorite Christmas story, one of my favorite Christmas movies. And It's a Wonderful Life is a favorite of mine also. But this hits the top. It's the Polar Express, and that is our second story tonight. Let's see here. The Polar Express, written and illustrated by Chris Van Allsburg. Take care, Tim. Great to have you in. Have a gobbletastic Thursday night. On Christmas Eve, many years ago, I lay quietly in my bed. I did not rustle the sheets. I breathed slowly and silently. I was listening for a sound a friend had told me I'd never hear, the ringing bells of Santa's sleigh. There is no Santa, my friend had insisted, but I knew he was wrong. Late that night, I did hear sounds, though not of ringing bells. From outside came the sounds of hissing steam and squeaking metal. I looked through my window and saw a train standing perfectly still in front of my house. It was wrapped in an apron of steam. Snowflakes fell lightly around it. A conductor stood at the open door of one of the cars. He took a large pocket watch from his vest, then looked up at my window. I put on my slippers and robe. I tiptoed downstairs and out the door. "All aboard!" the conductor cried out. I ran up to him. "Well," he said, "are you coming?" "Where?" I asked. "Why, to the North Pole, of course," was his answer. "This is the Polar Express." I took his outstretched hand, and he pulled me aboard. The train was filled with other children, all in their pajamas and nightgowns. We sang Christmas carols and ate candies with nougat centers as white as snow. We drank hot cocoa as thick and rich as melted chocolate bars. Outside, the lights of towns and villages flickered in the distance as the Polar Express raced northward. Soon there were no more lights to be seen. We traveled through cold, dark forests where lean wolves roamed and white-tailed rabbits hid from our train as it thundered through the quiet wilderness. We climbed mountains so high it seemed as if we would scrape the moon, but the Polar Express never slowed down. Faster and faster we ran along, rolling over peaks and through valleys like a car on a roller coaster. The mountains turned to hills, the hills to snow-covered plains. We crossed a barren desert of ice, the great polar ice cap. Lights appeared in the distance. They looked like the lights of a strange ocean liner sailing on a frozen sea. "There," said the conductor, "is the North Pole." The North Pole. It was a huge city standing alone at the top of the world, filled with the factories where every Christmas toy was made. At first we saw no elves. "They are gathering at the center of the city," the conductor told us. "That is where Santa will give the first gift of Christmas." "Who receives the first gift?" we all asked. The conductor answered, "He will choose one of you." Look, shouted one of the children, the elves! Outside, we saw hundreds of elves. As our train drew closer to the center of the North Pole, we slowed to a crawl. So crowded were the streets with Santa's helpers. When the Polar Express could go no farther, we stopped, and the conductor led us outside. We pressed through the crowd to the edge of a large open circle. In front of us stood Santa's sleigh. The reindeer were excited. They pranced and paced, ringing the silver sleigh bells that hung from their harnesses. It was a magical sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Across the circle, the elves moved apart and Santa Claus appeared. The elves cheered wildly. He marched over to us and pointed to me and said, "Let's have this fellow here." He jumped into his sleigh. The conductor handed me up. I sat on Santa's knee, and he asked, "Now, what would you like for Christmas?" I knew that I could have any gift I could imagine. But the thing I wanted most for Christmas was not inside Santa's giant bag. What I wanted more than anything was one silver bell from Santa's sleigh. When I asked, Santa smiled. Then he gave me a hug and told an elf to cut a bell from a reindeer's harness. The elf tossed it up to Santa. He stood, holding the bell high above him, and called out, "The first gift of Christmas." A clock struck midnight as the elves roared their approval. Santa handed the bell to me, and I put it in my bathrobe pocket. The conductor helped me down from the sleigh. Santa shouted out the reindeers' names and cracked his whip. His team charged forward and climbed into the air. Santa circled once above us, then disappeared in the cold, dark, polar sky. As soon as we were back inside the Polar Express, the other children asked to see the bell. I reached into my pocket, but the only thing I felt was a hole. I had lost the silver bell from Santa Claus's sleigh. "Let's hurry outside and look for it," one of the children said. But the train gave a sudden lurch, and we started moving. We were on our way home. It broke my heart to lose the bell. When the train reached my house, I sadly left the other children. I stood at my doorway and waved goodbye. The conductor said something from the moving train, but I couldn't hear him. What? I yelled out. He cupped his hands around his mouth. Merry Christmas! He shouted. The Polar Express let out a long blast from its whistle and sped away. On Christmas morning, my little sister Sarah and I opened our presents. When it looked as if everything had been unwrapped, Sarah found one last small box behind the tree. It had my name on it. Inside was the silver bell. There was a note. Found this on the seat of my sleigh. Fix that hole in your pocket. Signed, Mr. C. I shook the bell. It made the most beautiful sound my sister and I had ever heard. But my mother said, "Oh, that's too bad." "Yeah," said my father, "it's broken." When I'd shaken the bell, my parents had not heard a sound. At one time, most of my friends could hear the bell, but as years passed, it fell silent for all of them. Even Sarah found one Christmas that she could no longer hear its sweet sound. Though I've grown old, the bell still rings for me as it does for all who truly believe. And that is our second and final story for this evening, the Polar Express. Hope that you enjoyed those stories tonight as much as I enjoyed reading them. I kind of wish they had a smaller format of books, but they're nice and big if you get these in, person and, the actual books, these books, in to like actually read to, you know, kids on the, sitting on a couch or whatever situation. It probably work a little easier than on the live stream, but great stories and I enjoyed reading them. And yes, so thank you all so much for watching Once Upon a Turkey Leg tonight. Yes, two wonderful stories. Yes, so next we've got two more Thursdays in the month of two more Thursdays. Yeah, two more Thursdays, I think it is, in the month of December. And I've got stories for both those Once Upon a Turkey Legs for the remainder of December. Tuesday night, this coming Tuesday, I will be live for Let's Talk Turkey. It will be at 8 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock, which is the normal time, but it will be at 8 o'clock. I am going to be driving around the area through some neighborhoods and looking at some, hopefully, impressive Christmas light displays and doing my best at doing a Christmas sing-along. So join me as I try to remember all of the words to Christmas carols and songs while I'm driving and, streaming that should be entertaining. Um, Monday we'll be out at Disney. I've got a couple of streams that will be happening there from Animal Kingdom and Magic Kingdom. And then, of course, I am doing my Countdown to Christmas 2023, my Disney-themed series. Videos are up on the channel each morning at 9 a.m. And those stories will go through December the 25th. And so just a quick rundown of my upcoming streams. If you have not already, bop the like button for me, the thumbs up. If you're watching this on the replay, let me know in the comments that you are watching. And with that, have a gobbletastic night and a very Merry Christmas. And I will see you next time here on the channel. So take care, everybody.